The night was supposed to be ordinary, but fate had other plans. Deep in the quiet woods on the edge of town, the sound of muffled cries cut through the stillness. A young black woman, Naomi, found herself bound to a tree, the coarse rope biting into her wrists, the bitter sting of humiliation heavier than the pain itself. Around her, shadows moved, taunting, circling, feeding off her fear as if it were a spectacle. For a moment, the darkness felt endless, as though no help could ever reach her. But Naomi had something her tormentors underestimated: hope stitched into resilience, and courage hidden in silence. With one desperate call made before the ropes silenced her, a chain of events had already been set in motion, and when rescue came, it would not come quietly. Long before the ropes, the shadows, and the silence of the woods, Naomi's life was defined by something much simpler: survival. At 26, she worked long hours as a waitress in a small-town restaurant tucked away on a fading stretch of highway. The neon sign outside buzzed with an uneven glow, and inside, the air carried the smell of burnt coffee, fried food, and faint cigarette smoke that clung stubbornly to the walls. To most customers, it was just another greasy spoon where truckers, locals, and restless travelers passed through without a second thought. But for Naomi, it was the place where dreams were both starved and fed, a place that demanded her patience, her silence, and often her pride. Every shift felt like a performance. She carried trays heavy with food while balancing the even heavier weight of stares, whispers, and the occasional cruel smirk from customers who saw her skin before they saw her humanity. Her smile was practiced, her movements were careful, and her tone was respectful. But beneath it all, she carried an unspoken exhaustion, an exhaustion born not just of labor, but of enduring the minor, sharp cuts of everyday injustice. The restaurant had its regulars, men who sat at the counter with folded newspapers, women who came in with children too loud for their tired voices, and the occasional stranger whose presence either stirred curiosity or suspicion. Naomi knew them all by rhythm and habit: the man who never tipped. This woman always complained about, and the group of teenagers snickered whenever she passed by their booth. She endured it because she had to. Because the pay, however meager, helped keep the lights on in her small apartment and covered the costs of the classes she took at night, she was still hoping for something more. What most people didn't know was that Naomi's strength didn't come only from endurance. It came from the life she had built outside those walls, a life anchored by her husband, Marcus. To the world, Marcus was just another name, another man trying to make ends meet. But Naomi knew the truth he kept hidden. He was a highly trained member of Delta Force, a man whose life operated in shadows, whose missions were spoken of only in hushed fragments. He never boasted, never flaunted, but in his silence there was power, and in his love for Naomi, there was refuge. Their marriage was their sanctuary, even if the world outside refused to honor it. On this particular evening, Naomi's shift began like any other. She tied her apron, brushed a stray curl from her face, and stepped into the clatter of dishes and chatter of voices. The air was thick with grease and anticipation. The dinner crowd always carried with it a mixture of hunger and restlessness. At one booth sat a group of men whose laughter was louder than the rest. Naomi noticed them instantly, not because of familiarity, but because of the way their eyes followed her, calculating, mocking, as though her presence was an intrusion. Their boots tapped against the floor in a rhythm that matched their arrogance, and the smirk on one man's face carried the promise of trouble. She moved carefully, the way she always did when the energy in the room shifted. But she could feel the weight of their stares burning against her back, sharper than the clatter of forks against plates. In moments like these, Naomi often reminded herself to breathe, to remember that ignoring the truth was safer than confronting it. Yet something inside her told her this night would not end as the others had. Unseen by most, a man sat at a corner table near the window, dressed plainly, his expression unreadable. He observed quietly, watching the exchange, the tension that hung like a storm cloud ready to break. To Naomi, he was just another customer, blending into the background. But in truth, he was no ordinary diner. He was a wealthy and powerful CEO visiting under the guise of a traveler. His reasons for being there were his own, but his presence would soon intertwine with Naomi's fate in ways neither of them yet understood. For now, though, the night moved forward in steady rhythm. The scrape of chairs, the ding of the kitchen, bell, the rising hum of conversation. Yet beneath it all, a current of unease pulsed, invisible but undeniable. Naomi could not know that soon the performance of patience and silence would give way to something far greater, something that would demand not just endurance but courage. The hum of the restaurant grew sharper as the evening wore on, the voices overlapping in a constant murmur, silverware scraping plates, and the faint hiss of the fryer spilling into the air. For Naomi, each sound was a part of the rhythm she had learned to endure. But tonight, that rhythm carried a discordant note. The group of men at the corner booth had grown louder, their laughter edged with cruelty, their eyes fixed on her with a predatory persistence. She delivered their drinks. Without lingering, her movements deliberate and measured. Yet even in her silence, she could feel their taunts hanging in the air like smoke. A spilled drop of coffee was met with exaggerated groans. A polite smile was returned with mocking mimicry. The insults weren't loud enough to reach the manager's ear, but they were sharp enough to pierce her dignity. They didn't need words. The message was clear. Her presence was unwelcome, her very existence treated as a provocation. Naomi carried on as she always had, swallowing the sting, holding her composure. She had mastered the art of invisibility, of being both necessary and dismissed in the same breath. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the cruelty seemed less like a passing gesture and more like a deliberate performance meant to test her patience, to push her beyond the limits of silence. At the counter, a waitress named Carla, older, weary, her eyes constantly scanning for conflict, noticed Naomi's unease. She shot her a glance, a silent warning that spoke volumes. Stay quiet. Let it pass. Please don't give them a reason. Naomi understood. But her chest tightened all the same, as though every second of endurance pressed more heavily against her ribs. In the far corner, the plain-looking man who had slipped in quietly earlier, the undercover CEO, continued to watch. His plate of food sat untouched as his gaze followed the unfolding tension. He had been in countless boardrooms, had seen cruelty dressed in suits and smiles, but what he witnessed here was raw and unvarnished, the humiliation of a young woman reduced to an object of ridicule. He said nothing, but his mind turned, weighing what it revealed not just about the men, but about the culture that permitted such treatment to persist in plain sight. As Naomi worked her way between tables, the weight of the men's presence grew, heavier. She could hear snatches of their whispers, designed for her ears alone, comments about her hair, her skin, her very existence. It was a familiar kind of poison, one she had tasted before. Yet tonight it felt sharper, more dangerous, as though words were only the beginning of what they intended. Her hands trembled slightly when she returned to the kitchen, where the clatter of dishes drowned out the outside world. For a fleeting moment, she let herself breathe, pressing her palms against the counter to steady herself. Inside, a storm raged, the endless cycle of being diminished, the suffocating pressure to endure it, and the gnawing question of whether silence was a form of survival or surrender. Every instinct told her to keep her head down, to survive the night and escape unnoticed. But another voice whispered, quieter but insistent. What if surviving means allowing them to win? What if silence becomes complicity? Her conflict grew with each passing minute. She thought of Marcus, her husband, away, on missions she could never ask about, his life dedicated to protecting strangers in unseen places. She thought of his words, spoken late at night when the world felt far away. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act no one expects. Back in the dining area, the men's behavior escalated. A fork deliberately clattered to the floor, forcing her to stoop and pick it up as they smirked above her. A napkin was tossed carelessly, followed by a mocking apology that carried no sincerity. With each act, the diners nearby pretended not to notice, their silence a shield of self-preservation. That silence cut deeper than the insults themselves. The undercover CEO's eyes narrowed. He noted every gesture, every smirk, every act of calculated cruelty, but he did not move. Not yet. He wanted to see, not out of malice, but out of something, colder and more deliberate, to witness the courage or breaking point of the young woman before him. It was, in his own way, a test. Naomi felt the air grow heavy around her. The walls of the restaurant, once merely suffocating, now seemed to close in with every sneer and laugh. She longed for escape, but knew running would not silence the shame that had already been carved into her evening. Instead, she carried plates, poured drinks, and moved through the fire of their attention as though her body were made of glass, fragile but unbroken. And yet beneath her calm exterior, something was shifting. Each insult was no longer just an attack on her. It was an assault on the dignity of every person who had ever been told to endure. The decision forming in her heart was neither rash nor reckless. It was born of exhaustion and necessity, the knowledge that if she stayed silent tonight, the echoes of their cruelty would follow her long after the lights dimmed and the doors closed. The opportunity presented itself quietly, almost unnoticeably. As she approached their booth with the check, her eyes flicked to the small notepad she always carried, its pages filled with scribbles of orders and numbers. In that ordinary tool lay the possibility of something extraordinary. Her hand brushed against it as a thought sparked, dangerous but undeniable. Her heart raced, a drumbeat pounding louder than the chatter of the room. She could feel the decision crystallizing, her body caught between fear and defiance. This was more than service, more than survival. It was a chance, a narrow, fleeting chance, to speak truth in the only way she could, to slip a message into the world where silence had always reigned. As Naomi stood before the men, pen in hand, her mind swirled with the weight of choice. To act was to risk everything, her job, her safety, her future. To remain silent was to surrender her voice forever. Somewhere in the background, the CEO leaned forward, his attention sharpened. The air thickened with the kind of tension that precedes storms, when the world itself seems to pause, waiting to see which way the wind will blow. Naomi's hand hovered above the paper. Her pulse quickened. The rising action of her night, the steady climb of humiliation and unease, had brought her here, to the edge of something irreversible. The decision was hers alone. Naomi's pulse thrummed like a drum in her ears, each beat echoing the gravity of the moment. The restaurant's chatter had faded into a dull hum in the background, a mere soundtrack to the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Every nerve screamed warning, yet a quiet resolve anchored her trembling hands. The opportunity she had been waiting for, however fleeting, was here. She approached the corner booth, each step measured, every movement deliberate. The men were oblivious, wrapped in their own arrogance and the false safety of power, unaware that the woman they sought to humiliate was poised to turn the tables. Naomi's fingers brushed the edge of her notepad, the pen heavy with ink and intention. The act she was about to commit was small, almost imperceptible, yet carried the weight of justice she had long yearned to deliver. Her mind raced as she leaned over the table. The note slipped between the folds of the check with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this act 1,000 times in her thoughts. She could feel their eyes on her briefly, the weight of their scrutiny, but she didn't flinch. Inside, a storm of fear and exhilaration collided. She had chosen defiance over submission, courage over despair. The men continued their conversation, oblivious to the paper that had found its place. Naomi stepped back, her chest heaving as if the air itself had thickened with tension. Each heartbeat seemed to stretch time, elongating the seconds into eternities. The restaurant felt suspended between worlds, one where cruelty reigned unchecked and another where justice waited in silent readiness. She moved toward the counter to clear a dish, pretending routine, but every step carried the invisible weight of risk. Her eyes flicked to the corner where the undercover CEO sat, observing without a trace of expression. He had seen the entire sequence, from the microaggressions to the escalation of hostility, and now the deliberate act of defiance. In his mind, the gears were turning, assessing, preparing for what would come next. Naomi's heart threatened to betray her with its rapid cadence, yet she felt a subtle shift within herself, a part of her that had been quietly gathering strength. All these years, the part that endured whispers, sneers, and microbursts of humiliation had found its voice. Not a loud voice, not a public proclamation, but a precise, deliberate strike that would not be ignored. The men's laughter continued, a hollow sound now, tainted by the unseen consequence of her act. Naomi's mind raced with possibilities. What if the note was discovered too soon? What if it failed? What if she became the target of greater danger? But she had chosen this path, and retreat was no longer an option. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Minutes passed like hours. Naomi returned to her station, hands trembling slightly as she wiped down tables, the mundane task a fragile disguise for the storm she had unleashed. She could sense the subtle tension building around the corner booth. The imperceptible pause in the men's demeanor, the slight narrowing of eyes, the slow realization that something had shifted beyond their control. Then came the subtle signal, the scratch of paper moving against the tabletop, the faint rustle that marked discovery. Naomi dared a glance from her position behind the counter. One of the men lifted the check, unfolded the paper, and his expression shifted imperceptibly from amusement to shock. The note was brief, precise, yet it carried undeniable weight. The truth of their actions, the witnesses who had seen every insult and every degrading gesture, and the promise that accountability was imminent. The atmosphere changed in an instant. The arrogance that had filled the room evaporated, replaced by confusion, tension, and the first hints of fear. Naomi's pulse slowed only slightly. Her body was still electric with the thrill of daring. She had executed the act, delivered the message, and set into motion a chain of events that could not be undone. At the same time, the CEO rose quietly, unseen by most patrons. He moved with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to action. Yet he remained invisible to the men, a silent observer ready to intervene if necessary. His presence, though unnoticed, added an unspoken layer of protection, a quiet reassurance that Naomi's courage would not stand alone. The men exchanged hurried glances, confusion giving way to the faintest trace of fear. Naomi continued her tasks, outwardly composed, yet inwardly aware of the seismic shift she had initiated. Each glance, each gesture, each breath was now charged with meaning. She had turned her silence into a weapon, her restraint into leverage, her fear into defiance. The climax of the evening was not explosive in the way Hollywood might portray it. There were no raised voices, no dramatic collisions. Instead, it was in the subtle power of action, the quiet, deliberate choice to resist, to act, to assert dignity in the face of humiliation. Naomi had changed the trajectory of her night, and perhaps the lives of those around her, with a single act executed with precision, courage, and quiet audacity. And in the corner, the CEO nodded slightly, acknowledging the bravery that had unfolded before him, knowing that some battles were fought not with weapons, but with heart, intelligence, and the unwavering courage to stand when others would kneel. The aftermath of Naomi's quiet act of defiance rippled through the restaurant long after the final dish had been cleared, and the neon sign outside flickered in the night. The men at the corner booth were no longer smug, their bravado diminished by the subtle but undeniable weight of exposure. Whispers spread among the remaining patrons, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief at what had just occurred. Naomi moved among the tables with calm efficiency, her heart still racing, yet steadier than it had been for hours. She understood in that moment that she had done something far greater than merely defending her dignity. She had claimed it. Within the next hour, the note she had slipped with quiet precision found its way into the hands of those who could act. The undercover CEO, who had been observing the events unfold, made discreet calls to mobilize the right people without creating a spectacle. By the time the men realized that their actions would not remain unchecked, accountability had already begun to take shape. Managers, local authorities, and witnesses worked quietly behind the scenes, ensuring that the humiliation Naomi endured would not be repeated. The restaurant, once a place where indifference and cruelty had thrived, began to feel the first subtle shift toward justice. For Naomi, the emotional weight of the night began to lift, replaced by a strange combination of relief, pride, and an emerging sense of empowerment. The fear that had tightened around her chest like iron bands had not vanished entirely, it never fully does, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that courage, even when quiet and calculated, could spark change. She had learned firsthand that standing up for oneself did not always require confrontation. Sometimes it required patience, strategy, and timing, coupled with an unshakable belief in one's own worth. Her colleagues, previously accustomed to enduring insults in silence, began to see Naomi in a new light. Carla, the older waitress who had silently warned her to stay quiet, approached with a calm smile. In that unspoken exchange, Naomi realized that her actions had inspired not just a change in the men who had targeted her, but also in those who had witnessed her resilience. A ripple effect had begun, subtle yet undeniable, extending far beyond the restaurant's walls. The CEO, whose presence had been a quiet anchor throughout the evening, made his way to Naomi after the crowd had thinned. He did not praise loudly, nor did he offer grandiose words of admiration. Instead, he acknowledged her bravery with a simple, respectful nod, a silent affirmation that some acts of courage require no audience but themselves. Naomi understood, without a word spoken, that her actions had been seen, valued, and protected by someone powerful who recognized the stakes of her quiet rebellion. Beyond the immediate consequences, Naomi felt a shift within herself. The experience, harrowing as it had been, became a catalyst for personal growth. She reflected on the years spent enduring subtle cruelties and blatant injustices, realizing that her patience had always been a form of strength, but her courage in action was transformative. She no longer saw herself merely as someone who survived adversity. She was someone who could influence outcomes, who could alter the course of events with intelligence, bravery, and moral clarity. As news of the incident circulated in hushed tones, Naomi's story began to inspire conversations about accountability, respect, and the invisible battles faced by those who endure discrimination daily. It highlighted how ordinary environments, restaurants, workplaces, public spaces, can become arenas for cruelty but also arenas for courage. Her decision to act rather than silently endure demonstrated that change often starts with the simplest gestures, performed with deliberate intent and unwavering resolve. The men, once untouchable in their arrogance, now faced the consequences of their actions. They were reprimanded, their behavior documented, and the subtle culture of fear they had cultivated began to erode. For Naomi, this was not a victory in the form of vengeance, but a triumph of justice, a restoration of dignity, not only for herself, but for anyone subjected to similar treatment. It was a lesson that the power of one individual, acting with courage and strategy, could challenge systemic patterns of abuse and humiliation. In the quiet moments after the restaurant emptied, Naomi returned to the table where the note had been placed. She touched the edge of the paper, tracing the words she had written, feeling a connection to the strength that had guided her hand. It was a tangible reminder that courage is not always loud or explosive. Sometimes it is subtle, deliberate, and deeply human. As she stepped outside into the cool night air, Naomi's thoughts drifted to Marcus. She imagined him returning from his missions, unaware of the small but profound battle she had fought in his absence. The parallel between their worlds, his of physical danger and hers of social and emotional danger, struck her deeply. Courage, she realized, took many forms, and the strength to endure and act in the face of injustice was as noble as any battlefield heroism. Her story lingered in her mind long after the night ended, a testament to the resilience and agency of those often overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. Naomi understood that the path forward would not always be easy, that injustice would continue to appear in many forms. But she also understood something far more critical: the capacity to act, to assert one's dignity, and to demand accountability, rested within her, and within anyone willing to embrace courage when it mattered most. As the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, Naomi asked herself a quiet question that would echo far beyond that night. If one act of courage can change everything, how many more might follow when others find their own strength? In that question lay the promise of hope, the seed of transformation, and the enduring power of a single person to make a difference.